The 1980s were a transformative decade for jazz, a genre that had long been celebrated for its innovation and improvisation. As the world experienced rapid social and technological changes, jazz found itself at a crossroads, balancing the weight of tradition with the appeal of modern times. What happened when the smooth sounds of Kenny G collided with the fiery artistry of Wynton Marsalis? How did the rise of digital technology and global influences reshape this quintessentially American art form? This era saw the emergence of neo-traditionalism, the rise of smooth jazz, and a vibrant underground scene that pushed boundaries like never before. Ultimately, the 1980s set the stage for jazz's evolution, forging a path that would influence generations to come. One of the most prominent trends of the 1980s was the neo-traditional movement, spearheaded by young musicians like Wynton Marsalis. This movement sought to revitalize acoustic jazz by returning to its roots in bebop and earlier styles. Marsalis, along with his brother Branford and other young musicians, emphasized technical proficiency and a deep understanding of jazz history. The neo-traditionalists were often referred to as the Young Lions, and their approach gained significant critical acclaim and institutional support. Wynton Marsalis's appointment as the artistic director of jazz at Lincoln Center in 1987 solidified the movement's influence on the jazz establishment. Concurrently, a more commercially oriented style known as smooth jazz gained popularity. This genre blended elements of jazz with R&B, funk, and pop, creating a more accessible sound that appealed to a broader audience. As the decade dawned, smooth jazz was born from the rich soil of jazz fusion. Musicians sought to create a sound that was not only innovative, but also radio-friendly. The genre was characterized by melodic compositions that emphasized electric instruments, think synthesizers and electric guitars, while maintaining a laid-back vibe. Unlike traditional jazz, which thrived on improvisation, smooth jazz favored catchy hooks and polished production. Among the pioneers of this new sound was Kenny G, whose 1986 album Duo Tones became a landmark release. With its hit single Songbird, Kenny G captivated audiences with his signature saxophone style, making smooth jazz a household name. His music became synonymous with the genre, providing a soundtrack for romantic evenings and upscale gatherings. Another significant figure was David Sanborn, whose saxophone prowess shone brightly throughout the decade. Albums like Voyeur and Backstreet showcased his ability to blend intricate melodies with accessible rhythms. Sanborn's work helped solidify smooth jazz as a staple in adult contemporary music. Grover Washington Jr., although he had been active since the 1970s, reached new heights in the 1980s with his album Winelight. The Grammy-winning track Just the Two of Us became an anthem of the era, further bridging the gap between jazz and popular music. His ability to infuse soul into his performances made him a beloved figure in the smooth jazz community. The instrumental group Spyro Gyra also played a crucial role in defining the sound of smooth jazz during this time. Their unique fusion of genres created infectious melodies that resonated with audiences across various demographics. Their energetic performances and catchy tunes helped establish smooth jazz as a vibrant part of the musical landscape. As smooth jazz gained momentum, it found its place in the cultural fabric of the 1980s. It became a staple on adult contemporary radio stations, providing a soothing backdrop for listeners navigating their daily lives. Smooth jazz festivals began popping up across the country, drawing crowds eager to experience live performances from their favorite artists. The genre even found its way into television shows and commercials, further embedding it in popular culture. However, not everyone embraced this new sound. Jazz purists often criticized smooth jazz as being overly commercialized and lacking the depth of traditional jazz forms. Yet, despite these criticisms, smooth jazz continued to flourish throughout the decade. The legacy of the 1980s smooth jazz is profound. It introduced many listeners to jazz elements for the first time, paving the way for future generations of musicians. Its influence can still be felt today in contemporary music production and radio formats, where smooth melodies and polished sounds remain popular. In retrospect, smooth jazz in the 1980s was more than just a musical genre. It was a cultural phenomenon that captured the essence of an era marked by change and innovation. It provided a soundtrack for upscale urban lifestyles and laid the groundwork for future explorations in music, forever leaving its mark on both popular culture and the evolution of jazz itself. While smooth jazz dominated the commercial landscape, avant-garde and experimental jazz continued to push boundaries. The M-Bass Collective, founded by saxophonist Steve Coleman, emerged as a significant force in experimental jazz. This group sought to create a new language for jazz that incorporated elements of funk, hip-hop, and African rhythms. Other notable experimental jazz artists of the 1980s included John Zorn, who blended jazz with avant-garde classical music and noise rock, and the Art Ensemble of Chicago, who continued to explore free jazz and world music influences. The fusion movement that began in the 1970s continued to evolve in the 1980s. Artists like Pat Metheny and John Scofield pushed the boundaries of jazz rock fusion, creating complex, harmonically rich music that appealed to both jazz aficionados and rock fans. Miles Davis, who had been a pioneer of fusion in the 1970s, returned from a 5-year hiatus in 1981 with a new, more accessible fusion sound. His albums from this period, such as Tutu, incorporated elements of contemporary pop and R&B production. The 1980s saw the widespread adoption of digital technology in music production, which had a significant impact on jazz. Synthesizers and drum machines became more prevalent, even in more traditional jazz settings. Some artists embraced these new tools, while others viewed them with skepticism. The introduction of the compact disc CD format also changed how jazz was recorded and consumed. The longer playing time of CDs allowed for extended performances and encouraged the reissue of classic jazz albums, often with additional tracks. The 1980s saw a significant expansion of jazz education programs in colleges and universities. This trend, which had begun in the 1970s, led to a more formalized approach to jazz instruction and helped produce a new generation of technically proficient musicians. However, this institutionalization of jazz also faced criticism from some quarters. Critics argued that it led to a homogenization of jazz styles and a focus on technical proficiency at the expense of individual expression and innovation. The diverse trends in 1980s jazz led to what some called the Jazz Wars, heated debates about the nature and future of jazz. These debates often centered around questions of tradition versus innovation, acoustic versus electric instruments, and the role of commercial success in jazz. The neo-traditionalists, led by Wynton Marsalis, advocated for a return to acoustic jazz and emphasized the importance of traditional jazz standards. On the other hand, fusion and avant-garde artists pushed for continued experimentation and integration of new influences. The 1980s left a lasting impact on the jazz landscape. The neo-traditional movement helped revitalize interest in classic jazz styles and established a strong educational foundation for future generations of jazz musicians. At the same time, the commercial success of smooth jazz and fusion kept jazz relevant in the broader music industry. The debates and divisions that emerged in the 1980s continued to shape jazz discourse in subsequent decades. However, many of the stylistic boundaries became more fluid over time, with many contemporary jazz artists drawing influence from multiple 1980s trends. In the 1980s, jazz was characterized by diversity and debate. From the neo-traditional revival to smooth jazz, from avant-garde experimentation to evolving fusion, the decade saw jazz expanding in multiple directions simultaneously. This period set the stage for the continued evolution and diversification of jazz in the decades to come, establishing many of the stylistic threads that continue to define contemporary jazz. This is Paul from One Track Jazz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.